What do I need to be good at to be great at something?
Hello, everyone. You are listening to She Leads with Carly. And in this show, we talk to the absolute best, brightest, and yes, badass leaders.
Tap into where your natural curiosity takes you. Just making sure you're not your own roadblock. Even if you do fall, you're going to fall and you're going to learn.
Together, let's build a DNA of what it takes to rise to the top and truly make an impact. I'm your host, Carly Malatsky. Hello, everyone. I am so excited to welcome our guest today, Gracie Gold. Gracie is an American figure skater. She's a 2014 Olympic bronze medalist, a 6-time Grand Prix medalist, and a 2-time U.S. national champion, both in 2014 and 2016. In 2017, Gracie stepped away from the ice to seek help for her mental health around depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, and an eating disorder. She recently returned to the ice and has become a passionate mental health advocate, leading her to be featured in Sports Illustrated, the Players Tribune, the New York Times, HBO documentary Weight of Gold, and countless other news sources. Given her experience, she's led countless mental health initiatives and was recognized with the 2022 Bell of Hope Award. She recently released her memoir, Outofshapeworthlessloser, a memoir of figure skating, fucking up, and figuring it out. A book in which she provides the most authentic and deep look into her journey from growing up to where she is today, navigating the world of being in the public eye as an elite figure skater. Gracie, it is such an honor to have you on She Leads. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, and thanks for having me.
Of course. So, Gracie, I want to just get started with this memoir, by the way, which I've read and I've absolutely loved. I want to say, even off the bat, I don't even think of it as a skating book. It's almost everything around skating, and there's so many elements that I think will resonate with different people, whether it's just being an athlete, a woman, a perfectionist, the difficulty in the relationship you have with your parents, failing publicly. Like, there are all these different elements. I just want to dive right into that aspect. And how was that process for you? How was writing it and almost like recounting your whole life, if you will, from such a young age?
It was strange because most of my career in life, right, I've spoken about skating. And one of my goals, as you said, was to write a memoir that it's not a skating memoir. It's not a skating story, right? All of that information about my career is pretty readily available online or on Wikipedia already. NBC, ESPN, like they've it's been covered, but it's really everything in my life around it, for better, for worse. And it was really interesting to focus in on those parts because then typically with interviews for my whole life, everything's had to circle back to skating or to my career or to like an upcoming event, and to really have the focus be about everything from my childhood to my mental health crisis and everything in between was really cathartic in a lot of ways.
I imagine reliving that brings its own, wealth of feelings back. Did you have that feeling too of just like, shit, I went through that? Like, did you have kindness for yourself?
I guess it depends on yes and no. I guess it does depend on which parts specifically. Sometimes I still felt sad for that, past version of me. Other times I was frustrated, like, why did I make those choices? Hindsight's 2020. But then other times I felt like, oh, wow, I really did that damn thing. Or that was really, I didn't take that in the moment, maybe I didn't stop and appreciate how far I'd come, blah, blah, blah. For the most part, though, overall, it was healing and in a lot of ways validating. Not all parts, but I would say for the most part.
Yeah. So, okay, when you think of the memoir, you actually divide it into 4 parts. You have one when you were Grace Elizabeth, if you will, like you have your different personas. And then the next part is Gracie Gold. Then you have, out of shape, worthless loser. And then the last one is almost how you're reconciling with all of that. So it's kind of perfect. So on this podcast, I love to just go back to your childhood, who you were. So I want to know, tell me a little bit about Grace Elizabeth. Who was she? What kind of girl were you?
I was very spirited as a child. I know that I think it was difficult to raise at times. And I don't mean that as a cop-out for my parents. I truly mean, I think I had a lot of opinions and I shared them freely. I had difficulty with authority, and I didn't understand social nuances probably until my teens, like later teens.
Yeah.
I just said whatever came into my head. But I was fearless and extremely loyal and stubborn, and a lot of these things that made me really high functioning, but could also make me really difficult, right? I say in the book, like I just had a lot of big feelings all the time. I care about everything too much all the time.
Yeah.
And so in some ways, although that did make my story very interesting, it was full of emotional strife for large periods of it.
Yeah, totally. And I think it comes out so clearly in your book, right? Is like you said, you didn't have a filter, and that could have been to teachers, to coaches. You were sharing everything on your mind to the point where your mom would probably step in and be like, okay, Grace, let's tone it down, or let's think before we talk. And that was like almost a normal aspect of your childhood.
Yeah, I just was constantly in trouble for something that I had said all the time. And it got worse when I realized, I guess, how to be funny, or at least a little bit, because I realized if I would say something shocking, right, I found that to be very fun. Like the reaction from adults around me, I found that to be hilarious. My mother, not so much. So then it really just got worse there when I realized I could definitely make an impact. And I've always been a certified yapper. So, my mouth was open and running 24 hours a day. So I know I kept my mom on her toes, and my coaches as well, just 24/7.
Yeah. And one beautiful aspect that really carries through probably your entire journey is the relationship you have with your twin sister, Carly. Bias, great name, but twin sister Carly, you guys, and one thing that I actually found, there was even a bit of humor in it maybe, was the contrast between you two, like underlying beautiful relationship. But then you would say things where, Carly would be the sunshine and you would be the storm cloud, for instance. Can you just talk me through a little bit that dynamic, that relationship, and how important that relationship with Carly has been for you?
Oh, I mean, fundamental to who I am as a person. I always think it's so weird when I meet twins out in the world and they're not super close, because I cannot relate to that at all. In the book I say like she's the Artemis to my Nike, maybe she's the Watson to my Sherlock. And we either are exactly the same on something or opposite, but in the way that it's, two sides of the same coin, very much a yin and yang. I tell people like my sis Carly, right, was really shy. And so that's why I talk so much, because I learned how to talk for two at an early age. And we just fundamentally understand each other on a level that, it was always us against the world.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, I never knew how to, I don't even like the card game Solitaire, never learned how to play it. We were just attached at the hip for 22 years. And then even now, we're still thick as thieves in our adult lives.
I love this. You mentioned one time how she's like your emotional regulator almost. Like she's that person you can always like recalibrate with, if you will. And I think that's beautiful. Even how you like coined it, I think is so powerful.
Yeah, she was always able to like bring me back down, but in the same way that I could do that for her, because a lot of times like our anxieties or our emotional strife will manifest in different ways. So Carly tends to have a little bit more anxiety about things that I might perceive as everyday things, or just stuff, just to not worry about. And then she's more my like emotional regulator, because if I do feel something, I feel it very deeply, very intensely.
I love it. So take me back to that age. I think you were around 8 years old where you first put on figure skating. You went onto the rink and, you tried out figure skating, if you will. Was it that initial click? Was it immediate? Were you just like, I feel at home? Or how was that experience like for you?
So yeah, as soon as I was at that birthday party, right? So after cake and presents, you go on the ice for that hour public skates. And right away, I really was obsessed with it. And to be fair, I wasn't like the most talented skater that's ever, graced the ice, but I do think that it helped that I seemed to have a natural gift right away. Like I maybe spent half of a lap holding onto the wall, and then I was ready just to take off. I had this like innate sense of how to balance, and then I wanted to go forward, I wanted to go backward. I was flying around the rink. And so in some ways, I'm sure that that helped how much I liked it. We tend to like things that we're good at, but it just wasn't like any other sport that I had tried. And I was hooked. Like I really felt, saying I felt, at home, I'm not, but I mean, I loved it right away. Maybe that is correct. It seems a little bit like esoteric, but I loved it. Something about it really felt right from the jump.
Yeah. Because at the end of the day, you did experience all these different sports. You were just very active in general.
And I liked a lot of them, but it was very easy for me to eventually hone down to the point where I was just skating. It was not, like ditching swimming, not a huge problem, just not signing up for soccer, not doing dance company. Like these were all things that it just skating won every time, and it wasn't that big of a deal.
Yeah. So Gracie, eventually, as you got older, you reached a point where there was actually a good amount of years, it seems like, where skating was still on the side, per se. Like you weren't going to move and uproot your family to somewhere else just because of skating. It was still like school is very important. You were, it sounds like an excellent student. At what point do you think it became, you know what, like we actually have to devote more and kind of uproot our family in order to pursue this dream that is now, kind of becoming a reality?
So it was a tough decision because it was no longer just about me, right? The whole family would have to move. And I think that my mom, sister, and I agreed that we didn't want to split the three of us up. So they didn't want to just send me out to California or out to Colorado. And I think in some ways we waited as long as we did because we wanted it to feel justified, right? My parents didn't come from really like athletic background. So the concept of uprooting one's family life and home, kind of, especially in the traditional Midwest for ice skating, seemed ridiculous. And at least in some level, my parents are like, yeah, we don't want to put that pressure. Like we're only doing this. And if it only is okay if you make it to the Olympics, because the concept of that happening, my parents were aware was like statistically improbable. So eventually it was after I medaled at the US Championships in 2010 in novice, and I had all my triple jumps, and the coach that I was going to a few days a week up in Chicago was like, we really got to commit here. And at that point, it was just taking a huge toll trying to balance public school, and the drive from Springfield to Chicago was like 3.5 hours, and trying to make that work with an apartment there. It just was becoming so much that at that point, it actually might have just been easier to fully move to Chicago, which is what we did.
When you look back at that early days, even before 2014, before going to the Olympics, what do you think was most feeding you? Was it the competitiveness? Was it the glamour of it all? Was it winning? Like what was really giving you that energy of saying, oh shit, like this is fun. I need to stay in this.
I mean, that's a great question. I have always, there's that David Foster Wallace quote that says everything I've ever let go of has claw marks on it. So in some ways, if I commit to something, I really do commit to it. And I guess I just wanted to see like how far I could go in the sport on some level. Once I got all my single jumps, and then it was double jumps, and then it was your triple jumps, and then it was triple. How many can you do in a program? And in one way, that's, I think, why skating was a sport that I loved. It very much appealed to like my ADHD brain of there's always something to do, and there's always something to do better or differently and in conjunction with other stuff. It's not just, I remember swimming or track. It's like, okay, so do you see this circle? You're just going to run around it for the rest of your life, and you're just going to get faster. Or once you learn the 4 strokes in swimming, right? I thought, so this is it. I just go back and forth forever, and I just get faster at it slowly. Was a little bit less appealing to me. But with skating, and I guess that I liked in some ways, most people see it as a character flaw if you're not into team sports. I really am not built for it. I'm not a team sport or like a team player. I can maybe work in a pair, maybe just being a twin, but the concept of like soccer is like very frustrating for me. I just like to have the responsibility be my own, have it be my thing in my sports. And so I think just those little daily, weekly, monthly, and then yearly goals that were very at times felt very tangible, it was really easy for me just to keep chasing like that carrot, if you will.
Yeah. And I will say this though, too, is there's a level of drive and competitiveness, almost like your brain is rewired differently in a way, whether you're in an individual sport or a team sport. Because at the end of the day, you're competing for something, whether it's, the position you're in, maintaining your spot, getting to a starting spot. Like there are similarities that come into it where even on a team sport, like, yes, of course, the team success is your success. But at the end of the day, like you also have to have that voice in your head that's saying like, I'm going to beat this teammate of mine to play, outside defender or whatever it may be, so there actually are similarities that come into it. I agree with you. Like there's different dynamics, but it is something to note though, that I think is pretty similar across competitive athletes, if you will. As you continue down, eventually around 2013, 2014, the Olympics are in store, right? The Olympics are in sight. Take me through that feeling where one, it became a reality that you're going to the Olympics. Like what goes through your mind? What goes, is that just pure relief? Is it pride or is it anxiety?
So in the sport of skating, right, we don't really have Olympic trials per se, but the national championships right before the Olympics serve as our Olympic trials, if you will. And they are anywhere from they're typically like mid-January. And then the Olympics start in February. So in skating, you don't know if you're going to the Olympics until literally right before. So wow. I think from nationals in 2014, I think I went home for maybe a week. And then I was off to Munich for Olympic processing, where you get your gear and everything and check in. And then off to Sochi, a few practice days, opening ceremonies, team events. So it just goes. But I think I remember, it's crazy. Like I know some sports will know months out or they have their trials maybe like the season before, not in skating. And I wasn't totally written off, but I certainly, if I hadn't gone, it wouldn't have been this like huge shock. So two skates, two almost perfect programs at qualifiers. I knew when I finished my long program and it went really well that I do remember having a distinct feeling of, oh, I'm going to the Olympics. Like, I think I've done it. I think it's happening. And it was heavily relief. The feeling of relief was overwhelming because, it's all this build up for this, essentially these two, one's about 3 minutes, one, it's like 7 minutes of skating to determine if you go to the Olympics or not. And in Olympic sports, it's very key to go to the Olympics because you're either an Olympian or you're not. And so I remember feeling like that burden was taken off. Like now, no matter what happens, like I'll be an Olympian forever. I'll be a national champion and I will be an Olympian. Right. And that's like, thank God. I mean, I was overjoyed, but I do remember the feeling of relief and just that this was such a life-changing moment was profound.
Yeah. And I remember you mentioned, I think I read this in the book, but you mentioned how there was almost this unlock from a coach who said to you, it's not necessarily about the best skater, but the best skater that day. Because it is, at the end of the day, it does come down to those few minutes on the ice rink, if you will, to prove to, all of your years of work come down to this performance in this routine. How did that change for you? Did that give you almost that new sense of ease or no? Was that just like, okay, like I have to perform that day?
A little bit of both, I guess. I think that, that phrase or concept of, this coach was like, why do you feel like it has to be not just perfect, but it has to, like you have to go out there and make a moment. He's like, you could probably just go out there and like be fine. Like what if we were just okay? What if we were just pretty good? Because ultimately you just have to be the best skater that day. And he's like, it's amazing to win every single event, but he's like, that's why we have a podium. Mm-hmm. He's like, are you telling me that you're going to be, that if it's not first, you might as well not be there? He's like, what about second place? What about third place? And as a like crippling perfectionist, that was an interesting concept of being like, oh, okay, I guess I could make a mistake. I could even maybe make two and still be on the podium, and that it's not this tragedy. That was like an interesting school of thought that I had not considered before, and honestly hadn't really been brought to my attention in that way. I feel like if anything, it had been worded, if you just go out there and try your best, like it'll be amazing. Right. And I think being able to let go of it being result based. And I even tell my students that, like, stop trying to make the jump good. That's a result. That is, if we do everything correct on the takeoff and in the air, then it will be good. But to just go into a jump and say, like, I'm trying to make it good. What does that even mean? If we focus on, if we're just staring at the target the whole time, we miss the actual process of how we get to the target. Yeah, that was interesting. And that was helpful when it came to qualifying for the Olympics. Or things like, I think that if we just were okay today, you're going to go to the Olympics. Mm-hmm. And it was nice because I always felt before, like, you're trained, Gracie, to be amazing. Like, you're trained to be perfect. Everything's going to go great. And if you just relax, like, it'll be perfect. I have never been relaxed a day in my life. So I thought, okay, if I just calm down, I'll make the Olympics. Like, that didn't feel very tangible.
Right.
And yeah, Frank was the one that's like, I think that maybe even if it just goes fine, like not even close, if it just is 80%, like we should be good.
Wow.
And the fact that he seemed fine with that, and just that, yeah, he's like, there's honestly a huge chance that you could be at 70% of your best and still win, because we don't know what anyone else is going to do out there.
Exactly.
So this kind of change in thought process was interesting in some ways, just providing me some perspective and also some relief.
Yeah. I think there's almost like a life lesson in that, right? It's like, don't focus on the outcome, like enjoy the journey. And yes, people say that, and it's hard to do because at the end of the day, a lot of us are very outcome driven. But I think just reminding ourselves of, if you do the steps before, you will get an outcome that you are proud of or are happy to get. So I love that. I'm glad you said that too. So one thing that is fascinating to me with figure skating, and yes, the sport that I often, compare it to is soccer. So soccer, you win. It's very clear. It's literally who scores more goals. Whereas figure skating, it's so subjective. It's so reliant on the judges that day. And I want to just take me through that process and what lessons you've learned of, honestly, overall confidence and how relying on others kind of dictates your own confidence and how you've had to separate the two.
Yeah, what does make skating what makes it kind of unique in the world of sport is that the closest would be like gymnastics, is that you are judged. And so it's these strangers kind of, you don't really know, that tell you how you did. So ultimately, that was a little bit difficult growing up, right? Because it's like, oh, well, as long as you feel good, or if you just do your job. And it's like, no, actually, who's on the podium is how these strangers, like who they felt did the best. And when skating in, I think, 06, I guess, maybe 05, switched to the new system, that did help a little bit, right? So every jump, every spin, every element is point-based, but there still is a GOE, which is your grade of execution. So the judges can give it anywhere from a -5 to a +5. And then you have your artistry scores, which are anywhere from 0 to 10. So there's still this very subjective thing, right? So even if it's kind of like that quote, you could be the best, like ripest, most perfect mango in the world, and there's still people that don't like mangoes.
Yeah.
And, so if you're a mango and your whole panel doesn't like mangoes, it can seem a little bit out of your control. And as a control freak, that was probably one of my least favorite parts of the sports. But I think realizing that just because you're judged on the ice, that it doesn't necessarily mean that you're judged everywhere all the time, right? Skating is a sport of perception, right? We try to do the most difficult things while making it look effortless. And even if something feels good in our body, it is about how it looks. Even if you want to wear this color, how do you look in it? Is it a good cut for you? Is it a good color? And in a world of body positivity and, freeing ourselves from judgment, that doesn't always work with the sport of skating. But I have to remind myself that it can, right? Because things change, as well as just, being on the ice while you're competing. That doesn't mean that you have to live your life under those same rules.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's difficult. I guess I would say it's just been difficult.
Throughout your journey, if you will, and in your memoir, you're incredibly open about your struggles with disordered eating, right? And it stems a lot from this picturesque, image that you have to maintain. Take me back to 2013. I believe it was 2013 where you first got that hint of, I have to lose weight, or I have to, in order for me to make my jumps higher and better, there actually is a correlation between my appearance and my performance. Because before, from my understanding, before as a kid, like you weren't thinking about that at all. And then it slowly became, I think you wrote in the book, eating is calculus. Like you were counting everything. There was one point you were taking laxatives very often in order to lose that weight. So if you can recall, like what was that almost turning point that really did it for you, that kind of sent you in this whole new path?
So this is like one of the hard things I would say about being in maybe like an endurance sport versus a power sport is that there is a distinct, like, so the things that you do to maybe lose weight or to get in shape, like not all of those are inherently bad for you or, play into disordered eating, not necessarily, right? Drinking more water, getting 8 hours of sleep. What if we worked out a little bit more? Stuff like this, what if we cross-trained a little bit more? Like, just because you want to add Pilates into your routine for, core strength doesn't necessarily mean that you have any type of inappropriate relationship with food and exercise. So all those things that you do though to lose weight, those will also typically enhance your performance, right? You're probably going to perform better athletically if we are hydrated, if we are, running on carbs, fats, proteins, instead of just, you're probably going to do better than if you just had like Cheesecake Factory the night before, right? If we warmed up, if we did all of these things, you know what I mean? So things that will make your performance better can also a lot of times be similar to things if you're looking to cut weight or to lean out. So I was doing those things to cut weight and then my skating got better. And so instead of thinking, okay, it is just that I'm a little bit lighter and a little bit leaner, and then that has assisted my skating, I ended up correlating it to the thinner I am, the better I'll skate. So then at competition, if I went to an event and I felt like it was my perception of being thin enough, then it would just inherently go well, which is crazy because that's not even counting, that's just disregarding like all the training I did. I just was like, oh, if I'm skinny, I'll skate well. Yeah. End of story. I like made that correlation mean way more than it needed to because I'm a control freak and people, if you're an athlete with control issues, the eating disorder pipeline is right there, there. So I fell into that. And especially, I think it was harder to spot in a sport like skating as well, because it's an aesthetic sport. And also being able to differentiate between times that I wanted to lose weight because I wanted to skate better, right? If I'm going to jump for 4 minutes, if I am a little bit lighter, it is a little bit easier to jump for 4 minutes with less weight, right? Versus if you put on a 10-pound vest and did the same thing. That logic is not inherently kind of fucked up, but then there was an aesthetic moment where they're like, well, you would look better if you were thinner, like performance aside. They're like, you're going to get better scores like if you were thinner. Like you don't look the part of a skater. And that's one of the things in skating and like gymnastics as well, with the aesthetic is something you're judged on that can be very toxic, as well as society is still like very fat phobic. And if you're fat, it's associated with all these personality traits as if you are lazy, you're not driven, you don't have self-control, it's your self-indulgent, versus if you're thin, right, you have all those opposite things. You're a go-getter, you have self-control, you're diligent, you're determined, like, wow, look at that. When in fact, that's not inherently true. Like a lot of heroin addicts are very thin, but are not living their best or healthiest lives.
Right.
So there was a struggle there as well, where then if I would put on weight, I felt that I wasn't a good athlete and didn't deserve to have success, that I had to like want it enough, and that it wasn't just about training on the ice, that there was this sort of training off the ice. If I can train a whole day without any food, that somehow gave me this superiority complex over other people and my competitors. Right. This whole swirling cycle of terror that very much just started as, I don't want to say innocently, but I will say that coaches can certainly play a part in it. But I do think, saying like, hey, Gracie, can essentially we get back on the training wagon? I had done a series of shows and I was absolutely like eating. When I say like everything I wanted, I mean, like I would eat until I was sick because I was on tour and I didn't care. And the food was good and the food was free. And like, what, I wasn't not going to eat the whole cake. I was like 16, 17. So then when my coach was like, hey, we need to cut some weights, because I am an overachiever, I couldn't just cut like 5 pounds. I sent it down. I did fully sent it into having like really severe disordered eating.
Yeah. And so Gracie, a couple things. One is, what do you think fundamentally actually needs to change in sports like figure skating and gymnastics, where there is that aesthetic element to it, where they're watching everything and your physique actually directly correlates to maybe the points you get and your score? What do you think needs to change in the system?
I think that some of that is generational and some of that is like a societal issue, right? The same with, remember when Jessica Simpson was considered obese in society? Because she was like a size like 6 or 8. So as that is kind of changing, slowly, but it is a little bit, I think that it will translate to other parts of society. And in skating, I think just being aware, the difference of, is this a performance-based thing? Like, I think that, hey, I think you would perform better if we were a little bit leaner. That is not inherently like an offensive, at least in my opinion. I don't think that that's inherently offensive. I think that that can be more science-based of, again, I think that, I know that a lot of long distance runners can really struggle with disordered eating, because if you are going to run 26 miles, the less you have to carry for that duration, I have to imagine, is going to make that a little bit easier. So saying like, oh, it might be easier to run 26 miles when we're a little bit lighter, or like, hey, I think that we need to be a little bit more athletic. I think that we need to work out more, because you still need to be explosive at the end of your program, right? Like we need to do some more plyo because you can't make it through your 4-minute long program with enough energy. Like these things I don't think are inherently offensive, and that they're performance-based from an athletic standpoint. Other people might disagree with me, but that's my feeling. And then in the sport of skating, though, I think being clear about, is this a performance-based critique or is this an aesthetic? Like, in my opinion, you don't look like a skater, or you don't look pretty enough because we're not thin enough. We're not wearing enough makeup, the dress. And some people in skating that I've had this conversation with feel like, well, if you can't hang or if you perceive that as rude, then this isn't the sport for you. So I don't know about that. Right. I think that's a different conversation. But I also think that there could be more research, and like there's very limited research right now about if you do have an eating disorder, how do you go back, like once you are kind of in recovery, how do you go back and like if you want to be an athlete again, what's your return to play from having an eating disorder, right? We have them for concussions, we have them for physical injuries, but right now, and I've been told this by like eating disorder counselors, is like, we actually just recommend that you don't, that like, you just don't try to diet or exercise anymore, because you're essentially going to relapse. So I'd be interested in, and maybe more research has come out since I was like first investigating this, but I was like, oh, when I came back to skating, I thought, what's a healthy way that I can do this again? And honestly, the research was like, well, you just don't. It's like, once you're an alcoholic, like you just don't really drink again is like the thing. Like how do I party after recovering from alcoholism? There's like party like with liquor. You don't like that for most people. Like the research says and suggests that you don't at all. Some people maybe
eating,
can.
It's different.
Yeah. And being aware of, I also think the intensity of eating disorders, I think is something that people don't talk about enough, because they're classified as an addiction, but they are not taken seriously by society at all. Because once society, first off, there's like a bunch of different types of eating disorders. You don't have to be thin enough to qualify. I've heard that a lot of, well, there aren't that many anorexics. I don't see that many thin people. That's, you can be any size and like have an eating disorder. As a society, we don't even acknowledge that men have eating disorders. They're still just for girls. And in a misogynistic society, if something's just for girls, it's not taken seriously. And also, to be thin is to be valued more in society. So here's the thing about eating disorders, but so they're just not, no one really cares. But the problem is that unlike other, like you can cut out heroin, cut out crystal, you can cut out alcohol, you can't really cut out food and exercise. So you just have to live the rest of your life managing, your addiction.
Yeah.
Right. So if you just had to have if an alcoholic had to have 2 drinks every day, if some narcotics had to have just like 2 bumps every day, and you can't have any more, but if you can't have any less, and you just have to manage that every single day of your life. So I think also valuing it more as that this could be a very potentially serious mental illness. I think also people would think 2, 3, maybe 4 times before they make inappropriate comments, or just treat it as if you're, again, like, so what, you get an eating disorder, like you'll be better for it. That's, yeah, sorry for that monologue. I just get like very intense about it.
No, understandably so. I understand that so wholeheartedly. And Gracie, another thing is, what advice essentially to a young girl listening to this? I think one thing from reading your memoir is that, I can understand it too. My own experience, it can be a very independent, insular process. Like you would skip meals with friends and you would very much keep it to yourself in a way until it got to a point where, okay, it became noticeable. But what that means to say is whether you're a competitive athlete or not, there's a lot of, different signals that happen today that can spur this on, whether it's social media, all of these different elements. What advice do you have to young boys and girls actually who are feeling this, or at least going down this route? What is the best way to go about it, in your opinion?
That's a really good question. I am not a therapist or a psych, right? So something that maybe I would have done differently for my own journey is, again, to acknowledge, again, what is performance-based and then what is like me-based. So like, do I need to lose weight and it'll make me, and also being able to separate my self-worth from that. So even if I felt like I wasn't worthy in society, I felt like I wasn't worthy as an athlete, and I felt like I didn't fit in the sport if I didn't look a certain way. And now some of this is skating, right, specifically, but again, in a fat-phobic society, this might resonate with a bunch of different people, but I felt like if I wasn't thin, that there wasn't a place for me in the sport of skating, because there aren't a lot of bigger, like not skinny or certainly plus size skaters. There just really aren't any, So anyone listening, close your eyes, and if you picture a skater, they all look exactly the same. Almost no difference in terms of like a physical traits. Right. And being able to separate that, and also my self-worth. So even if like losing some weight might have made, or just leaning out, being a better athlete would have helped my performance, it didn't mean that I was a piece of shit and that I was suddenly this like lazy loser. That when that started to become the correlation, or that I didn't deserve to win this event because I was bigger, like that's not written anywhere. Like it's not a written rule anywhere, right? It's on your, like when they score your performance, there isn't like a specific thing that says weight, right? It's not like boxing. We don't get weighed before events. So being able to separate that and keep a clear distinction there would have been very helpful. Course, yeah. And knowing that even if I was the biggest girl on the ice, it didn't make me a loser. Like it didn't make it less than, because it's not an event to see who's the smallest, right? That it is an athletic event. And that if I was the biggest, but I was the best, I was still the best.
Absolutely. And so, okay, so around the same time, around 2016, 2017, you were also suffering from depression. You were very depressed, sleeping all day, almost, again, to yourself in your apartment. And I love this part actually in the book where you're at champs camp. And I'd love for you to just talk through this, but you got the urge almost that you were like, okay, I have to share what I'm going through. And that's when Jen and Susie come into the picture, if you will. And you mentioned Jen, she's a team doctor, and she said she's one of the few that asked me how my life was outside of skating. And it's just like so powerful, that little statement actually, because it just shows how much you went through and how, again, people conflated you with the figure skater and that's it, and like your success in figure skating was just how you were doing in life. So talk me through that process, which ultimately you ended up going to a treatment facility, but talk me through the importance of actually sharing that with someone, telling someone, and, someone else going through that. Again, how important it is to kind of be outside of yourself and share it with someone, because it feels really hard to do that.
Yeah, and sometimes there were some people along the journey that were like, oh, well, we did mention it, or maybe we felt like something wasn't going well. But, if you ask someone kind of in passing or in like a like public space, or maybe if you just ask them once, like, oh, yeah, hey, how's the fam? How's everything? Okay, good. I'll see you later. That's like not creating a safe or comfortable space to give that answer if something isn't going correct. Because it is weird. Like, it honestly would have been weird, the amount of people that maybe asked me how I was doing, but not in like the correct place or environment. It would have been really weird for me just to like trauma dump on them. But again, not saying it was like anyone's fault, but with Jen and Susie, and I think Brandon was there as well, they asked in like a correct space. It was just us in the USOC kitchen, just doing whatever. But there was ample time for me to answer. And it was just really like the 3 or 4 of us. And so I think that's why I did. But yeah, they had asked something right, like, oh, how's the family doing? And I was like, I don't know. Like, we don't talk anymore. They're like, what? And I was like, oh yeah. They're like, where's your dad? I'm like, I don't know. Like, he sucks. What do you want me to say? And I think that was just like jarring. And the fact that they actually seemed to care in what I at least at the time perceived like a truly genuine way, not like oh no, I'm sorry to hear that. They also seemed just like genuinely shocked, and they had follow-up questions. And then, a few days later after a day or two later, and I hadn't showed up to any of the meetings or like the team building, whatever. No one had really seen me. Still sleeping all day in my room. I think that's when, they mentioned it like, hey, based on the behaviors that we're seeing, and also when we talked with her, there's a chance that this isn't behavioral, meaning like I'm just out here to be lazy and annoy everyone. But we think that we're having like a huge mental health crisis is what's happening, and that we actually need help for this. Which then subsequently ultimately changed the trajectory of my life, because I didn't kill myself and I got help and was able to slowly climb my way out of that, depression pits that I had dug for myself. But I think the fact that they made a safe space where I could answer, and that there was time for me to answer. Because when people ask how you're doing in passing, like at work, and you're like, yeah, this would be
good. Of course. Yeah.
Yeah. And later that person's like, oh, I had no idea that they were going through that or going through that divorce. And it's like, you asked, but you didn't really ask. Like, it would have been weird at the water cooler in the office if I told you about my divorce. Totally. It was like a weird place to do that. And I'm not saying that you have to take everyone out to dinner and have like heart to heart, but at least being able to try and create a safe space where somebody can answer and it's appropriate for them to answer can really go a long way.
Absolutely. And at one point you even mentioned it got to a point where if I wasn't a skater, why should I continue to exist? Like you reached that point. How much unlearning did you have to do to separate Gracie Gold, the human, Grace Elizabeth, if you will, from Gracie Gold, the elite figure skater that you became?
Oh, I mean, a huge amount. And I think that's pretty common for any type of, like most mental health struggles. Because to find who you are outside of your own addiction or mental health issue or trauma can be difficult, because in a lot of ways it's all you've known. And there are those people that, I think we've all met them, the ones that just live in the trauma and like really stay there, because honestly, that's all they know. Like if they don't know themselves outside of the trauma, and that if the only relief that they can get from their existence is by, being the victim like that, it is so difficult to leave that. It's like an uncomfortable comfort zone, because that's all you know. Who are you outside of, like, who was I outside of skating and my eating disorder? I don't know, because first off, both of those things had been with me longer than most people in my life. And secondly, I actually don't know, because I'd spent every single day of my life just with one of those two things for the past, like 15 years. So I actually didn't know what I liked or like what I wanted to do or what my normal whatever was. And so there is this refinding of yourself, like who you are outside of that and outside of your self-destructive behaviors. Because we as humans, we do like routine and we do like consistency and predictability a lot of times. And to suddenly venture out of that, and even though they're bad things, but to leave those behaviors and those cycles behind can still be very difficult and very scary.
Absolutely. And so, Gracie, you talk a lot about quieting the inner critic, right? We all have an inner critic. I want to know, what does that look like for you today? How do you quiet that inner critic?
I think that quieting is the like really key phrase there, because I think at first I thought that it would go away and that I would be able to turn it off or that it wouldn't exist at all. And instead, I found more success in more of like a harm reduction kind of management situation. So even if that critic is there, what if they're just a little bit less critical? You know, so yes, maybe something isn't good, but it might not be the worst ever. You know, like what if it was just fine? Then I'm like, maybe it just was a fine day. Maybe it was not very good, but like could have been worse, I guess, kind of like thing. Cause that was really difficult for me, because if it wasn't perfect, like why do it? You know, the concept of if you're not going to do something at 100%, don't do it at all. When in fact, if you do 20% of something, you know, you're still 100% better off than you were if you hadn't done it at all. And sometimes that extreme of if you're not going to do it 100%, don't do it at all. You know, that can be, you're either then at 0 or 100%.
Yeah.
So being like, okay, if I don't have the emotional capacity or energy to clean my whole apartment, you know, maybe I will just take the trash out, or maybe I will just at least put the clothes in the washer, hopefully transfer them over. But like, you know, maybe we're not going to do the entire house top to bottom until it's spotless. And maybe that's just fine. You know, maybe it doesn't make me a great person, but maybe it doesn't make me a loser either. Maybe it's just okay. So trying to meet maybe the like inner critic in the middle and approaching it more as that harm reduction has been at least really helpful for me in terms of just also managing my day-to-day stability. You know, at least because instead of putting together 4 days a week that I'm the best ever, followed by 3 days where I'm the worst ever, you know, sometimes you just put together a week where everything was okay.
Yeah.
Wasn't anything great. It wasn't anything bad. It just was everything's okay. And then building upon all those okay weeks, I found easier to just continue on the way up.
I love that. I absolutely love that. And it reminds me even of, you know, some days, like you said, some days you only have 20% to give. So if you give that 20%, great. You gave, you know, that's 100% in a way, like you gave your all. So Gracie, I have 2 more questions for you. One is, where is Gracie today? What are you up to? What does life look like right now?
Pretty simple-ish right now. I guess I just, obviously my book came out in February, and so we're still doing some media and stuff for that. And I had major hip surgery at the very end of December of last year. So I've actually been in Colorado Springs at the Olympic Training Center doing rehab and physical therapy and all that good stuff. And yeah, just kind of seeing where the rest of the spring and summer takes me.
Amazing. And my last question is, I ask this to every guest that comes on the podcast, is what craft are you spending a lifetime honing?
I'm a big crocheter, so I think that's why I literally was like, oh, I have a craft. I have a hobby. But I guess honing, I guess just trying to be, I guess just the craft of stability as somebody who really likes to oscillate between extremes. We're up, down, you know, sideways. Honing the craft of stability in all meanings is probably what I'll be honing for a long time.
I love it. Gracie, thank you so much for coming on the podcast, sharing your story. And this book is so incredible. I really encourage everyone to go get it. It gives you such a raw look into you, who you are, the journey, what it takes, everything. So thank you for being that authentic with us.
No, thank you. And thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for listening to the show this week. If you enjoyed, please spread the word. Tell someone about She Leads or post about it on social media and tag us. If you want to contact us, feel free to send over a message through the She Leads Instagram page at sheleads.show. If you want to follow us on Twitter, our account is at SheLeadsShow and mine is at Carly Malatsky. This episode was produced and edited by Nick Furshow. Thank you also to our partner, Floodgate. If you're passionate about startups and want to learn more about the starting journey of those who have built groundbreaking companies, I highly recommend listening to Starting Greatness with Mike Maples Jr., the founding partner of Floodgate. He has an incredible show that, in my opinion, is definitely worth your time. Thanks again.